Okay, we'll keep getting them in.
Thank you. And how are we doing on the YouTube feed?
I haven't turned that on yet because I was
Okay.
recording first.
Okay, cool. Let me know when you are able to get that going and we'll kick things off. Thanks everyone for bearing with us.
There, you're gonna start it and turn it over to me for introductions.
You got it. All right. Okay, I know we're recording, so I'm gonna get going here. As I said, for those of you who just came in, thank you so much for being here tonight and joining the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County for a wonderful presentation on the decline of local news and the impact of that decline on our democracy. We're joined tonight by a fabulous panel of League members from all over the state representing the League of Washington. And I'm so grateful to all of them for coming and sharing their expertise and for undertaking the incredible work to research this really important issue. Before we get going, it's our practice to make a land acknowledgement and a labor acknowledgement, so I will do that now. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor them with gratitude and honor the land itself as well. So in our league, we like to pair the land acknowledgement with an action item. And with the holidays coming up, I wanted to share that there's going to be an art market at the Duwamish Longhouse in West Seattle. And I'll go ahead, and it's a native art market with native vendors and food. So I'll go ahead and share the details for that event in the chat. And I definitely encourage folks to check it out and shop local and all that good stuff. So moving on to our labor acknowledgement, we added this and it's been a really wonderful way to sort of connect more deeply with the history of our country. And to sort of situate ourselves in this discussion, figure out how we can create connection to some of the uncompensated labor from our history. So I'll read that acknowledgement now, and this is adapted from the Oregon Education Association. We pay homage to those stolen from Africa, placed in chattel bondage, forced into labor, and called slaves, to those who lost their lives blasting through mountains to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and to those who labored in our fields to feed the world. We honor their ancestors for their forced, unpaid, underpaid, and exploited labor that built much of the Americas. To Indigenous, African, Asian, and Hispanic forebearers, we commit to the continued struggle for liberation, reparations, labor protections, due process, and equal access. For it is through this injustice that we truly give honor. So thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm hopeful that everyone will feel engaged with this issue. And at this point, I'm gonna hand the mic over to Deanne Finken, who is sort of the ringleader of this incredible research team. And Deanne, I'm gonna have you introduce yourself and the rest of your team.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather. Is my audio okay?
You sound great.
Okay, great. And I had a colleague in this ringleading effort here. So my co-chair is Dolores Irwin, who was formerly the president in Kittitas County, and she's here. There were 10 of us who put together this project, and it really is a labor of love. We were all very deeply involved and all contributed and made it a better project because of our contributions. So I'll briefly just introduce my colleagues here. Linda Hughes is a member of the league in Bellingham, Whatcom County. Linda, do you want to just wave or something so we know who you are? She retired from employment in community college student services and later direct service and then management and federally funded employment. And she has a long history of community involvement and interest in journalism. Joanne Lasowski, there's Joanne. She holds a PhD, had a career in multimedia journalism, and then taught journalism and advised student media at Pacific Lutheran University for more than 20 years. Her tenure at PLU included 3 Fulbright Awards teaching journalism overseas. Carol Reichert. Carol is our genealogist. She joined the league about 5 years ago when she represented another civic organization at a league event. I think she was intrigued by the league methods. She's been an avid reader of local newspapers since she was 9 years old, and she's retired from federal employment. Lauren Snyder, there's Lauren. She was in academic biomedical research, including 27 years at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. She holds a PhD and holds high regard for the value of accurate, reliable, and accessible information to drive decision-making. And she's from Seattle King County. Sally Carpenter Hale, who you will hear much from here shortly. She's a retired bureau chief and account director who spent 40 years with the Associated Press in Texas, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. She was the founding president of the Pennsylvania Freedom of Information Coalition and served on the boards of that Pennsylvania News Media Association and its foundation. As I mentioned, Dolores Irwin is co-chair. She was a newspaper reporter at in Southern California, various newspapers, including the Orange County Register. She also identifies as a former bureaucrat for a public hospital, a city, and a community college district, all in Southern California. As I noted, she's a former league president in Kittitas. I've been a member of the league myself since 1986. I joined when I was on maternity leave from the Fresno Bee, where I was a staffer for a dozen years or so. I was a longtime freelancer for the Oregonian in Portland, and I directed the journalism program at Clark College before I retired in 2018. And do I have us all? I think I covered us all. Yes. And now I'm going to turn this over to Sally Carpenter Hale, who has a little presentation. We're happy to answer questions. I think Sally's going to note that we hope you will wait till the end, and so it's more corralled and we can respond more thoughtfully. So Sally?
Thanks, Deanne. I am just going to share my screen here. We are. So thank you all for joining us and for inviting us to share the highlights of our study. We're a committee of 10 league members from throughout the state. We began looking at the impact of the decline of local news on Washington 2 years ago, starting as an affinity study group. Then in June 2021, delegates to the state convention approved our proposal for a statewide study. And on November 14th, the state board approved the study. So the next step is for local leagues to address the consensus questions early next year. With that in mind, we'd like to share with you what we have learned. Please save your questions until the end of the presentation and we will answer them then. In Washington, newspaper circulation is down 43% since 2004. The state has lost 20% of its newspapers. And the decline in local newsroom staffing means diminished coverage that has left communities without vital information. This decline has negative consequences. Robust net local news, from government coverage to public health information, helps provide the glue that holds communities together. Reduced local news coverage results in fewer people voting and running for office. They are less plugged into their communities, and political polarization grows. Accurate public health information is harder to obtain, and government costs more when elected officials don't have reporters looking over their shoulders. Hold on. Here we go. The situation in Washington mirrors what is happening nationwide. The United States has lost a quarter of our local newspapers since the start of the decline. If a community has no newspaper at all, it is known as a news desert. If this trend continues, we could lose one of every 3 papers by 2025. Yet 70% of people aren't aware of this decline. Let's pause and explain how we define a newspaper. We recognize that more people prefer to read news online and that more news organizations are cutting back on print publication. We consider a newspaper any publication, whether in print, online, or a combination of the two, that provides continuing, comprehensive, and accountable reporting of a community's people, government agencies, schools, and activities. This quote from the editor of the Spokane Spokesman Review explains this thinking nicely. Which brings us to the question, why study local newspapers and not TV or radio? Local TV news does not provide the same in-depth, day-to-day reporting of city and county councils and school boards as newspapers do. In fact, stations often will use a newspaper story as the basis for their own story. We reviewed all the weekly and daily newspapers in Washington, comparing those published in 2004 with those published now. We noted which ones closed or stopped publishing in print and whether they had new owners or circulation changes. For example, King County lost 11 newspapers and Snohomish County lost 9. We also looked at how many newspapers were produced in each county. We learned Washington has 13 counties out of 39 where only a single newspaper is produced. Asotin County has no newspaper, though it gets some coverage from a paper across the state line in Idaho. Here are the 11 newspapers that stopped printing in King County between 2004 and 2022. One other daily, the Kent Covington Reporter, went to weekly publication. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer still publishes online, but it no longer provides comprehensive reporting of the area's people, government agencies, schools, or activities. King County has 39 cities and towns with governments. There are also 27 census designated places, unincorporated communities that are locally recognized and identified by name. There is now only one daily paper, the Seattle Times, that circulates throughout the county. While many newspapers have closed, others continue to publish, but in a much reduced form. Here's a look at 4 in Washington. Note that while page counts have declined, the cost of buying a paper has increased for all of them. In Tacoma, the News Tribune publishes nearly 2/3 fewer pages, but charges double for them. In Bellingham and Ellensburg, fewer than half the number of pages, but twice the cost. And in Spokane, more than 25% fewer pages, but a price that's 1/3 more. Papers that continue to publish but have very little content of substance are known as ghost newspapers. One example is the News Tribune in Tacoma. It once was a highly regarded paper that was purchased by a hedge fund during a bankruptcy sale. The hedge fund, Chatham Asset Management, bought 5 other Washington newspapers, 4 of which have also seen reduced circulation and staffing. The experience in Tacoma gives us a picture of how the decline has resulted in dramatically uneven coverage for communities. Tacoma is the 3rd most populous city in the state, with nearly 250,000 people. Yakima is considerably smaller, with a population of fewer than 100,000. but the newsroom staffs are nearly identical in size. Think about that. How does such a small news staff cover a community that is more than double in size? We were particularly interested in how the decline has affected government coverage. In some states, more reporters are covering the government now, but not Washington, where the news staff has been cut by more than half. Here's a photo of the Capitol Bureau in Olympia 2 decades ago, 16 full and part-time journalists. Today, we have only 5 full-time journalists assigned by established news outlets. This quote from Paul Query, the AP's former state editor, describes the situation. It's not just at the state level that government agencies and officials aren't getting enough coverage. Throughout the state, newspapers don't have the staff to continue covering scores and scores of city councils, county commissions, special districts, and school districts. The Seattle Times and Everett Herald eliminated their outlying news bureaus, which severely curtailed and in some cases eliminated suburban government coverage. Reporting and editing are labor intensive. Despite reports about artificial intelligence that can report and write, not many people anticipated replacing human journalists. So job losses directly equate to less coverage of communities. Compared to the nation as a whole, Washington has experienced larger staffing declines, 67% versus 50%. Not long ago, no one initially filed to run for mayor in Gig Harbor, which lost local news coverage until the nonprofit online paper Gig Harbor Now came on the scene. Likewise, in Bellingham, where the Bellingham Herald has reduced its coverage, incumbents had no opponents in several races a few years ago. So we were not surprised when we read a study that looked at 11 communities in California. It found that mayoral races were closer and had more candidates, and communities where newspapers had more reporters and editors. Washington State University professor Travis Rideout says less information leads people to lose interest in government. There's also a link between local newspaper declines and voter turnout. The Seattle Times looked at the voter turnout in the 2021 general election. In Yakima County, turnout was an abysmal 32%, the second worst among Washington's 39 counties. And in Franklin County, where the Tri-City Herald slashed its newsroom, turnout was just 29%. We did a study of our own, reviewing turnout in February special elections in every county in Washington. We reasoned that turnout in an election for a school or fire bond or levy might measure civic involvement more accurately than the turnout in a heavily publicized election. In all but one of Washington's 39 counties, voter turnout decreased from 2012 to 2020. In some counties, the decrease was significant, nearly 13% in Asotin County and more than 11% in Benton County, for example. No newspaper is published in Asotin County, although the area is served by the Lewiston Tribune. When we looked at the impact of the decline on civic engagement, we found a great resource pretty close to home. Portland State University professor Lee Shaker focused on the closure of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer's print edition in 2009. Using data from the US Census, he defined measures of civic engagement. Shaker said after the 146-year-old Post-Intelligencer stopped printing, he tracked declines in 2 areas: in people demonstrating their political and social values by buying or boycotting services or products, and in participation in community groups and organizations. Shaker said a ghost newspaper can be more problematic than no newspaper because seeing a newspaper makes people think they'll be informed about things such as problems with their drinking water. National studies connect the dots between local newspaper declines and greater political partisanship. Washington State University professor Benjamin Shores says that's because national coverage is conflict-driven, while local coverage is more community-driven. If you don't have a local newspaper, there's no place where you can write a civil letter to the editor, so people more often repost memes about national political figures. Local media is a major source of information about disease outbreaks, both for readers and public health officials. Officials rely on newspapers to alert residents to what's happening in their communities and to inform them about how to maintain and improve their well-being. At the same time, public health officials rely on local newspapers to track people's activities and behaviors. In Kittitas County, the public health officer learned about a potentially dangerous situation, an indoor memorial service for an elderly couple in the middle of the COVID pandemic. When Dr. Mark Larson read about the upcoming event, he was able to contact organizers and recommend preventive actions to keep people safer. All of the public health officials we talked with warned about the dangers of people relying on social media for their health information. When newspapers close, it costs more to run local government. Without reporters watching local officials, government tends to expand with more employees and higher wages, increased county deficits, and higher tax revenues. That results in higher borrowing costs for cities and counties. Building a hospital or school can cost as much as 11% more after a newspaper closure. That extra cost can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional interest at taxpayer expense. State Treasurer Mike Pelichotti believes journalists' role as public watchdogs is paramount. Attorney General Bob Ferguson is concerned about how the local news decline affects government accountability and oversight. He read a news story about Motel 6 in Arizona sharing guest information with federal immigration officers and wondered if the same thing was happening in Washington. He launched a civil rights and consumer protection investigation that led to a $12 million settlement. Ferguson has led an effort among other state attorneys general to support federal legislation for tax credits for local news. There are many causes for the decline. Newspaper advertising revenue has fallen dramatically as advertisers have discovered how much less expensive online advertising can be. Once 80% of the Spokesman Review's revenue came from advertising. Today, the paper receives only 35% of its revenue from advertising, and subscriptions, which have also declined, don't bring in enough to cover the costs. Big tech has been a major player in this trend. In a Commerce Committee report, US Senator Maria Cantwell accused large platforms that post links to local news stories, such as Google and Facebook, of being unfair and deceptive and engaging in abusive practices. Those two platforms account for 75% of the digital advertising revenue in local markets. In the wake of the decline, people's reliance on social media as a news source has skyrocketed. The report takes a look at this, taking care to discuss the problems social media generates, including its lack of oversight and the frequency of it being a significant source of mis- and disinformation. One Twitter study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology indicated false news on that platform is on average about 70% more likely to be retweeted than information that faithfully reports actual events. We also report on the benefits of social media and how in some locations it is the primary vehicle for distributing information people need. That's the case in Kittitas County, where more people subscribe to a community Facebook page than to the local newspaper, the Ellensburg Daily Record. For their part, newspapers were slow to adapt to readers' growing preference for online. Many have failed to provide in-depth reporting on major issues. Readers complain their local paper is expensive, too boring, and too political. However, the future is not necessarily all doom and gloom. Legislation has been introduced at the federal and state levels that offers a variety of proposed remedies. Some state laws have passed and are making a difference. More and more nonprofit news operations are starting up with financing from grants and readers. Support remains strong for newspapers that serve communities of color. And some communities are stepping up to raise funds for their local papers. Several legislative solutions have been proposed. Washington legislators this year decided against continuing a small B&O tax credit for newspaper publishers that we've had since 2009. The proposal didn't get out of committee after the sponsors said people on both sides of the aisle were opposed. But the bill now has been reintroduced, so it may be reconsidered. Opponents of the bill questioned whether government has a role in supporting private business, but many companies benefit from government support. Washington aerospace manufacturers have received preferential tax rate reductions that total more than $90 million. Other aerospace companies received tax credits totaling nearly $100 million. Nonprofit news organizations in Washington, including Gig Harbor Now and The Jolt in Olympia, are doing a thorough job covering local government. These 8 nonprofits in the state are all either online only or a hybrid of print and online. Loyal readers have helped keep afloat newspapers that serve communities of color in Washington. And an increasing number of papers are turning to their communities for tax-deductible support. For example, the Columbian in Southwest Washington has raised more than $1 million to hire 3 full-time reporters. The Seattle Times has paid for 27 positions in its 120-person newsroom through community giving. Not all these efforts have been as successful. In Tacoma, only 88 donors contributed to a fundraising campaign that fell flat. So the question remains, are these few bright spots sustainable? In fact, there are serious doubts as to whether these strategies will sustain the increasingly fragile local news business. All right, here we go. It's not a journalism problem. It is a democracy problem. Historians point to long support for newspapers even before we became a nation. Our founders established protections for the press and the US Constitution. We already have postal subsidies for news publications, along with government-financed public television and radio, and legal protections for the press. As President Thomas Jefferson said, a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. For this work, we conducted more than 50 interviews and consulted more than 500 reports, articles, and studies. We prepared it in a different way from many league studies. We used an approach known as long-form journalism, making it read more like a lengthy magazine article. We believe this more conversational style and structure makes for a more enjoyable and informative read. We also created distinct sections, the main narrative, and another section we titled A Deeper Dive, where we feature more comprehensive stories about single topics. We also have a Cliff Notes style outline that we believe members will find useful when they meet to discuss the report. We appreciate your time and we'd be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Sally. I do want to jump in here, and because I realized another of our committee members has joined this session, and she is Lynn Whitley, and I want to just briefly do a little introduction of Lynn. She earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Journalism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Lynn worked for 10 years covering local news in North Carolina and Alaska before moving to corporate public relations and advertising in the healthcare industry, and later in commercial banking for 35 years. Thank you for being here with us as well. And as I mentioned, everybody on this committee worked to make it a better report, and we are very proud of it. Carol, you did a little more work this afternoon, because we've tried to kind of customize each of our presentations at least a little bit to the leagues that we're presenting to. Did you have some more information you wanted to share about your research related to closures or changes at King County newspapers?
Well, in King County newspapers, that was the most newspapers for any county, and therefore had the greatest losses. But we thought you might be interested to know where we got our data for the newspaper charts that we made, that Excel chart. The first place, of course, was Penny Abernathy's News Desert study. That was our original list, and that was what we started with. And that was Deanne that made that first chart. And then I went after the Washington State data to find all of the counties and how many towns and cities were in each county. And so we had multiple references for that. We used the Washington State data book. We use the Washington State Library newspaper collection. We use the Library of Congress Chronicling America newspaper collection, newspapers.com newspaper collection. We got a lot of information on sidelines that explained our data from the US Census Bureau. We also used Wikipedia, looking up cities and towns to find definitions for them and discover what news sources they had. And there's another interesting website called Mondo Times, which is a worldwide media locator and had reams of information on newspapers. And we also got a lot of information from the Institute for Nonprofit News. And we got information on counties and cities from a local Olympia organization called Municipal Research and Services Center, which allowed us to copy some of their data and then just send us a list of what we asked for. So we had a lot of cooperation from a lot of sources, and there is a lot of information out there for anybody who'd like to dig a little deeper.
I think we would probably also note that things are changing so rapidly in the industry that what was accurate and up to date yesterday, today is no longer accurate and up to date. And it was really important for us to get this report out there because things are changing so quickly and at such a pace. So I think, are we ready to, if anyone has questions, we're happy to provide what we can.
So I'm gonna look through the gallery. If people want to actually raise their physical hand on video, you're welcome to do that. You can also write in the chat in all caps, write Q : followed by your question, or just the word question followed by whatever your question is. Or you can use the raise hand icon. If you go under reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a raise hand button. So those are your options. And I will try to keep an eye on all of those. Let's see. I'm not seeing any hands. Oh, John, you want to unmute and ask your question?
First of all, I found out about the report from Dudley's column in the Seattle Times.
We're having a little trouble hearing you. Is
Okay.
it possible to move?
Can you hear
That's much better. Yeah, it's still a little fuzzy, but
me
it
now?
will, yeah,
Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. I just want to note that I learned about this report on the Briar Dudley's column in the Seattle Times. So I think we should note what the Times is doing with Briar Dudley's column to give information about media. And he also has a website that he had once a week. So my question is, can we contact you people at the league and get a printed copy of this report as opposed to printing out from your website?
Okay, question about accessing this fabulous report. Deanne, you want to field that? You are muted, Deanne.
Frankly, I'm not a person who knows an answer to that. Mary Coltrane, maybe you are in a position to know, or Dolores, do you know?
Yeah, the answer is yes, you can get a printed out copy. We have budget for that, so call the State League office and ask for a printed out copy. It's pretty long, so there aren't going to be a lot of printed out copies, but we do want to make it available to people who might not otherwise be able to take advantage.
Okay, and if anybody on the study team has the capability of putting that phone number for the State League office in chat, that would be fabulous. Or anybody else who is listening and able to find that. John, we will make sure that we include that information in the post-event email as well. That will go out to everybody who's in attendance tonight on how to access a printed copy. Okay, I see lots of questions coming through the chat. Tony Okada is asking, is the league doing anything to encourage Congress to pass the legislation that has been proposed?
I think I can field that question because we are, this is a state league study. Our authority stops at the state line, basically. Although we've been told that, federal, the US League may have interest in this. But right now, I think we are just looking at developing enough support for consensus to consider developing a policy for the state league to adopt. But yeah, those are the two that are getting, those two federal bills are getting a lot of attention. The Local Journalism Sustainability Act and the Safe Harbor Act, which the name, I can't remember the full name. I'm sure that Joanne has that handy. What's the other? The Safe Harbor is called the
Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which is being looked at really closely right now by Amy Klobuchar as chair of the Judiciary Committee. It's being sort of brought up. It is on the agenda during the lame duck session. So that's something that has been very encouraging for the legislation. That's the bill that protects, that offers local and national journalism operations the opportunity to get Google and Facebook to pay them for the content.
Thank you. And we will post links to that federal legislation in the post-event email as well. Carol, I see your hand, but I'm going to field Janice's question first and then get down to, I'll call on you to ask your question orally once I get to it in the chat. So Janice Camp asks, could you speak to the new not-for-profit investigative journalism groups such as Investigate West and their contributions to the press and information for the public? Deanne, you just went on mute.
Sally's probably the point person on that. I know she did a lot of those interviews with the nonprofits.
I can take that one, and let me just share that slide again. These are the ones that are in Washington State as of right now. Some of them are very locally focused and some are more statewide focused, such as Investigate West and Crosscut in particular. Crosscut has a relationship with the local public television. So they get some funding from them. They do share their content with anybody who wants it. I see a lot of their stories in the Columbian locally. And the same with Investigate West. They're more investigative reporting. They dip down into Oregon, but they're primarily focused on Washington State, in my opinion. But these others, a lot of them are very locally focused. We talked about Gig Harbor Now. The Key Peninsula News prints monthly, but they update their website more often. The Salish Current. The Jolt covers Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater. These others, Yes Media and Grist, are issue focused. Grist focuses on environmental issues, social justice, and so on. And Yes Media is kind of the same thing. So I wouldn't really include them so much in our study. But talking to the editors and publishers of most of these publications, they're having trouble keeping afloat. They get some money locally, they get some grants. The Institute for Nonprofit News is a huge funder of a lot of these nonprofit news sites around the country. They have a matching program. So if a local nonprofit site can raise a certain amount of money, the INN will match it. But the editor at the Jolt told me he'd be lucky to stay in business for a couple more months, and it's just always kind of this hand-to-mouth existence. So they're doing okay for now, but it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I think the long-term sustainability is a question for almost every publication. Down here Sally and I are both in Southwest Washington, and the Columbian has raised $1 million, but that's going to run out in time. So it's long-term sustainability is the question. And does the league have a role in playing any part in seeking support?
Okay, all right. Thank you for that question, Janice. I think we are on to Dan's question, and we have Kim Albert here, who's going to be stepping into our program chair position shortly. So I wanted to give her a chance to ask some of these questions on behalf of our attendees. Kim, are you able to come off mute? Hang on one sec. All right.
Yes.
All right, you're good. Okay, do you have Dan's question up?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for being game to try this.
You bet. How many of the existing newspapers are controlled by a small number of corporations or other entities? I'm not sure who can take that one.
Yeah, I'm going to try. I think, do we count 5? Only 5 are family-owned newspapers still in the state. Am I accurate? Am I correct with that, Carol? The Columbian down here in Southwest Washington, the Seattle Times, which also owns the Yakima paper, the Spokane Spokesman Review, and what's the other one? Help me.
And there's the small family-owned newspaper down in Benton County, and one of them is the Dayton Chronicle, and the other one is in
Washingtonian, East
Yes.
Washington.
Yes, the East Washingtonian, and that's owned by it's a tiny little newspaper, but it's owned and published by a couple as a retirement project. And they are keeping it going in these little tiny towns with a readership of less than 1,000 for each paper. But a lot of their community are snowbirds, and they go down to Arizona or wherever. And so they had to do an online edition, because when the loyal newspaper readers are down south avoiding snow, they still want to know what the girls' basketball team is doing. So that kind of loyalty is something that we kind of noticed in the family-owned papers, where the publisher has been going for a while. There is a bonding, and people will support that paper. So there is one potential solution somehow. I don't know how it works, but maybe.
And, Linda, you can probably speak to the Cascadia Daily News, which is owned by the one artist, I can't think of his name.
Unmute myself. The Cascadia Daily News started up in January of last year, so it's been going for almost a year. There was a large amount of money by David Syrie, who is a wealthy business owner here in Bellingham, and Ron Judd is the editor and publisher of the newspaper, and they are they publish weekly a print paper and daily and online paper, and are now requiring subscription for the daily paper, but it's distributed throughout Whatcom and Skagit counties and the island counties as well. The print copies are distributed weekly and are still free in many places. So be interesting to see at the end of this year sort of where they are. The expectation was that even though it's independently owned and funded, that it would become self-sustaining at some point. And it's interesting what's happened, because the Bellingham Herald was owned by a hedge fund and provided very little local information. But since the Cascadia Daily came into existence, the Herald has really stepped up their local news coverage. So yeah.
I think, would it be accurate to say Sound Publishing is the holder of the largest number of papers? Carol, you probably know that. And
Yes, they are. And they are expanding as well.
But they're kind of a little bit intriguing, because sometimes they're basically using content from another paper that they own and producing it as if it were a full stand on their own paper, but there's a lot of borrowing, I think, of content from sister papers, right?
Yes, and there's also been consolidation, especially in the King County Metro Seattle area. Those little independent suburban papers kind of got combined and consolidated, and looking at those papers over the last year, I think something is lost. But when we interviewed Josh O'Connor, his intentions are so good, but no, it's money. It's always money.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, are we ready for the next question? Kim, you want to take
Sure,
that one?
they're asking about getting the URL for the online copy. And my understanding is that that will be sent out as a follow-up email.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's in the chat. It's in the chat.
Yeah, that's correct. It's also been in the chat. And then I think that brings us to Carol Butterfield. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I actually have one comment relating to the local little tiny things trying to make it. And that is that I'm kind of a big news consumer. And the other trend that I have seen, besides just the local newspapers and media outlets struggling, is this new phenomenon. I don't know if it's new, but people, I don't know, influencers, journalists are now opening up their own, essentially Substacks and newsletters, which I find troubling because what it does is it just further splits it out. And now you're paying for content. In theory, you could follow there's Josh, oh God, there's a bunch of them. But anyway, Josh Marshall, that's the name. You could sign up for 20 of these and be paying subscriptions for these things that used to be carried under the banner of a bigger media outlet under their opinion or their columnist. So I find that kind of disturbing because obviously, for people who can afford to do it, great. But if you can't, it's really further siloing it and putting it out of the reach of a lot of people who might benefit from hearing their words. So that's my comment. My question has to do with, I was under the impression that some countries actually financially support journalism, kind of like a PBS or an NPR. I know we're talking old times, but that was the idea anyway, and that they do this in the service of democracy and an informed citizenry. And I'm wondering if any of your study panel could comment on this and discuss whether that's a model that could ever work in our country.
Well, I think Joanne, you're probably pretty versed in that area, aren't you? Joanne was a Fulbright scholar, but not in Great Britain, but you are, I think, up to speed on some of that, aren't you?
Well, it's like, Carol, they're going to think that I paid you to ask that question because I always want to talk about this and how worried the citizenry in the United States is when we talk about funding good, honest, accurate communication. Where much of the rest of the world does this with their public service journalism, which you can see what happened in the 1920s when the broad spectrum, the ether came on, and the US immediately went to the commercial model when much of the rest of the world, including the UK, went to the public service model. They have been there since then. The government puts money in a pot, and then somebody oversees that pot, not the senators, not anybody who's making a living as a politician, but somebody else does that and distributes the money to the journalists. The BBC has always been independent, and we can do that here, but we have this commercial model. We have this fear, this incredible fear that the government is going to take over. And all it takes is looking at Australia, Canada, CBC, ABC in Australia, BBC. These are very independent journalism organizations that do the best reporting in the world, and they're not being run by the government. But that's soapbox done. Okay.
I love your soapbox.
I wonder if this is a good time to talk about Robert McChesney and his kind of interesting perspective. And I know that Joanne, you interviewed him as well as I think Sally and maybe Dolores. No, Dolores, you were part of that interview. I was not. So I don't know if you want to share just a bit. I know we're running out of time, but that seems like a natural fit.
Well, McChesney's work has started when he did his dissertation at the University of Washington, where he looked into what happened in broadcasting when the rest of the world all noticed that there's this ether out there that can be used for the public good. And the US decided to go with a commercial model, the rest of the world, just exactly what I talked about. But he now thinks that the US, it's incumbent upon the US to put a whole bunch of money in a pot and make sure that there is good, reliable, and honest journalism. And he is wholly in favor of this, has a whole model, decided how he's going to do this, has been lobbying Congress for years and years that this is something he's excited about. Some of the laws that are being introduced, but he doesn't think it goes far enough. Is that pretty good, Dolores?
Yes.
Is that sort of?
I think it's interesting though, and we probably should share about closer to home here in the state, what happened early this year when the measure to extend the business B&O tax preference happened when, Joanne, you're up to speed on that one as well. And the response by just the committee members, the measure never got out of committee. Fortunately, I don't know if it's Pellicciati or was it Ferguson who's calling for that to be reintroduced, but
Ferguson.
Ferguson, okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, the comment from one of the senators was that, basically if newspapers are having trouble with their business models, well, maybe they shouldn't be in the business of news, in business, right? But they better get their acts together as business people. But do you want to have anything else to say about it?
It was pretty discouraging just listening to the conversation. It was very short. They didn't spend a great deal of time. It was the very first time that the committee talked about it. And it was the commercial, I can't remember the name of the committee, but they look at industry
Commerce, yeah.
in the country, in the state. And so apparently this B&O tax has been on the books since 2013. And it's about
Yes,
to
around that, yeah.
it's about to sunset. And that's why it was brought up again, to just give the business of journalism some kind of a break in their B&O taxes. And it's not a big break, but it's something. And it's about to sunset, and it looks like it may sunset. But how little they talked about it, how little they knew about the business of journalism. Fortunately, Thompson, what's his name? Roland Thompson talked for a few minutes to give them some bit of an education on what this bill is about and what journalism is about and how important it is. But they didn't, they were laughing. There was a huge laugh from the person who introduced the bill. And we talk about this in the presentation, that nobody wants this. I don't know why I'm even introducing this bill, because nobody wants this.
Well, and Dolores has a good observation.
Yeah, I do. I go nuts about it, because the significance of it is, if they can't even get a tax break in a state like Washington, what does that tell you about how the legislators feel about being overseen by reporters? They don't want it. It should have been a no-brainer. And that just emphasizes, I did a lot of the finance stuff, and that's why I'm so adamant about this particular point, is that public agencies that deal with money have to be watched. And if the newspapers go down, who else is going to do the watching? We've talked about League having an observer corps and helping in that way, but that is a really, they're volunteers. They're not being paid to go to every single one of those meetings. And if you don't watch people handling money, they are going to spend it the way you don't want it to be spent. And that's been demonstrated over and over again. And someone asked a question about that in the chat. And yes, it's absolutely been researched. Even it's been known for many, many years. And that's why we discussed there was a study done particularly about municipal bonds. So it's known by the bonding agencies. If there's no newspaper, they raise the interest rate, because they just figure that there's going to be more money spent by government on employees, higher taxes, just all kinds of things. And so they will automatically, if there's no newspapers, raise the percentage rate. And, besides all the other funding business that can go on with, and I support government in general, I do, but they need to be watched. And that also includes, they've recently done a study about corporations and the amount of shenanigans that if they're not being watched and reported on, they will continue to, that they're getting caught at. Anyway, that's my rant.
Yay.
So I think that brings us to Duffy Clark's question. She writes in the chat, I'm wondering if the study committee reached out to the Seattle Times to see if they have archive info about the loss of independent journalism, both in Washington state and across the US. I'm a huge supporter of the Times and give my financial support to its independent journalism department.
Dolores, do you want to take that?
What is the question?
Sure. She's asking if if your committee reached out to the Times to see if they have any archive information about the loss of independent, about this dynamic of, the decline of local independent news in Washington state and across the US. So does the Times have any archive info on this topic?
I don't know about archive, but that is the purpose of Briar Dudley and his free press newsletter. He is specifically there to report about this issue. And yes, he was actually one of the technical reviewers to make sure we were doing all the right things in our reporting.
And we
So
interviewed Mike.
I'm not sure if that answers your question.
And we interviewed Mike Fancher, who was a previous editor, and then Frank Letham, currently president. What is his title now? Editor? I forget. So yes, we did have interactions with the Seattle Times, but I don't think we asked specifically about their archiving of that kind of information.
I know that their archives is accessible through, it's either free or a pretty affordable subscription, and then you can search by keyword, because I've searched their archives for League of Women Voters. So yeah, I mean, you could probably pull up articles if you just searched for, independent journalism or some other key phrase like that. Okay, so let's see. Polly and Bob ask, you mentioned the relationship between higher government expenditures to local reporting. How do you know that this is true causation? And Polly and Bob, I don't know if you want to come off mute. You're talking about, remind us what statement you're following up on.
I think
there.
I think you answered that question.
Okay.
Well, so yeah, you had mentioned a couple of people had responded to that.
Okay, great.
Appreciated that very much.
Okay, great. We're weaving all these themes together. Okay, so let's see. Donald asks, he says, I support taxpayer funding of journalism just like we pay taxes for the police, but how can they fairly decide which journalistic outfits get money? And then he asked Breitbart. So does anyone want to field that? What kind of criteria would shape that sort of funding process?
I know Dolores has spoken about that a few times. I mean, the fact is laws are not, administered equally, and there's some stinky stuff that happens sometimes. But Dolores, do you want to talk more about that?
Well, just that, how it's done. There are a lot of different suggestions in the legislation of how to do it, but our thing, or the main purpose of this study, is so that we can get the league to take a position, and so then we'll be able to advocate. But exactly how it's done, that would have to be all worked out. And there are studies, like there was a study done by USC about the different ways it could be done, where it could be indirectly. You wouldn't necessarily just go handing a bunch of checks to each outlet, but there would be a certain amount depending on the criteria for, we are of course in favor of local news. That's what's important to us, is that, and that all of these different impacts that we are talking about is specifically because of loss of local news, not necessarily national news or TV and radio that doesn't report on local news. So the details would be worked out in each piece of legislation, and then whatever the league is willing to support, that, that would advocacy team.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Does somebody else from the committee want to respond to that? Yeah, Joanne.
An example of details that have to be worked out: several years ago, Washington State adopted a shield law and passed the law in the state legislature. And what they spent the most time deciding about was how to define a journalist. And there must be at least 7 or 8 different criteria that they had determined was necessary in order to define a journalist who would be protected by the shield law in Washington State. So that kind of detail is not what we're, as Dolores said, that's not what we're concerned with. What we primarily, we put this together so that the league would say, we agree journalism is important to democracy.
I want to jump in here, but I was just looking at participants here in this presentation, and I noticed that Professor Peggy Watt from Western Washington University is on this, and she's important to us because she was also a member of our technical review committee. Are you there, Peggy, or is it just your title up there?
No, I'm here. I'm here.
I didn't want to go without acknowledging you then, and so
Thank you.
I hope maybe you have something to contribute, although I realize we're running out of time or have run out of time.
I joined you a little bit late because there was an SPJ regional board meeting tonight too. So I hopped over to this. The one I don't, so I didn't hear the beginning, but I obviously know what the presentation, the study was.
It was a great
but
asset
I,
to the study. Thank you.
Thank you. I was contacted by one of my state representatives, Alex Rommel, and he was interested. He's interested in promoting some kind of legislation to support newspapers, and so I gave him some resources, including referencing your study. And so if he got mentioned earlier, I apologize since I sneaked in late, but he might be a person too, a legislator who he expressed interest.
And we did hear from his office. At this point, the process is we need to work with the local leagues and league members to develop consensus. It's not appropriate for us to get involved in any kind of legislation until we get a clear measure of the sentiments of membership. And we really can't do anything, and it wouldn't be right. But his office, and then also we've heard from Karen Kieser, who is, I think, south of Seattle, who's a state senator.
Jerry Paulette would be another one too.
Okay. Jerry.
Get in touch with who? Jerry Paulette. Yeah.
Thank you.
Deanne, I have a question, if I may. I first of all, I want to make sure that we're being respectful of your team's time. I did advertise this until 8:30, so
okay.
if I sprang that an extra half hour on you, I apologize. But if you're willing to indulge another question or two, I'd be grateful.
I think we are. I was afraid we were supposed to end at 8. And I mean, I think you can tell by all of the comments from our committee members, we really do care about this issue. And we've put our hearts and souls into this. And so we're happy to.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, then I will take the liberty of firing away here. So my question is sort of from the perspective of a younger person, although I'm in this sort of awkward limbo of not really being fully like on TikTok and some of those platforms, but also, not ever subscribing to a printed copy of a newspaper. I've always been an online subscriber. So I guess I'm describing myself as a millennial. So I guess my question is, did you talk to younger generations about what kind of news they're consuming or support they feel they need in order to get access to reliable, independent news? And then my second part of my question, well, why don't I just pause there and then I can ask my second question.
I'm thinking when I try to come up with a response to that, I'm thinking of two individuals in particular who are on the younger spectrum. Rob Curley, who is the executive editor of the Spokesman Review, who is just a really impressive guy and very inspirational, as well as Will Campbell down here in the Columbian. And certainly Will Campbell's comment to us was that, he envisions a day where newspapers are printing one day a week and everything else is online. And that's going to be a lot more accessible and preferable to younger generations. I can't speak, but, and I don't know how much, our study really didn't look at things like TikTok. We looked at social media to an extent, but we didn't deal with TikTok. And then who was it? Ben Shores was talking about really how inconvenient and really how inefficient the print model is, right? I mean, it's very labor intensive, it's time consuming, you miss a lot of opportunities by relying on the paper. But then there are plenty of people who prefer that tactical experience. I don't know if anybody else has something to add to that from our committee.
Well, I'd like to ask Heather a question in return. Heather, people who are millennials, people who are Gen Z, obviously you are younger than those of us on the committee. So would you expect to get journalism-driven news on social media? Would you expect it?
Yes, I would, because I feel like I have developed the tools to discern credible journalism from less reputable sources.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is I don't consider social media as sort of a monolith, right? We have people sharing, articles from all of the papers you've mentioned, if they have an online presence, sharing those articles on social media, and they take you to the newspaper's website. It's just social media is the vehicle for, getting you there, right? It's instead of Bob Ferguson like picking up, the paper to learn about that consumer issue that you flagged, or the motel reporting issue, maybe he just sees it online. So that's kind of like, it feels to me like an easy equivalent, but I think the other piece of it for me, is that social media has created journalists because people who are just everyday people who care enough to show up to local events are showing us with their cameras what is happening in front of them. And so it's like, it's like a police body camera. There's not like a layer of interpretation or analysis or synthesis that they're imposing on top of their observations. They are, publishing a first person recording of what's going on. And the reason I think that's critical to consider as journalism, and to supplement news media, right, print media, is because when we were thinking about the George Floyd protests, there were people who were at those protests filming what was going on with the police, and that footage became a critical piece of sort of holding police accountable who were using excessive force, but also showing us what sequence of events led up to certain, sort of explosive moments in those encounters. And so, I think that video footage, certainly it can be doctored and so on and so forth, but, Facebook Live, I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had that coverage, we would be poorer for it. Understanding what happened there, we would be relying on third-party accounts and hearsay, and I think it showed a different truth. And I also think that my bigger point, and I realize I'm taking a lot of airtime here, but out of that sort of effort, there were a few people who were really at the front lines of the protest. Came a whole new channel online called Converge Media, and it became a daily news show, about the protests, and then also the aftermath and sort of the different oversight bodies, how they were handling the complaints that arose and beyond, right? And then became about other social justice events and issues, also all local. And they would interview people who would come on. And so I kind of feel like, and there was, of course, print articles that emerged on their website as well. So in some ways, it's almost like, how do you even, it goes back to, I think what Joanne was saying, like, how do you even define what a journalism is? Like, when does it become journalism versus just someone there, right, who happens to be recording?
Well, I think you touched on the issue of media literacy and being able to discern and having the ability to say, oh, this doesn't really look right. I need to look further. Because how many people do that now? I mean, we've seen that, widespread, questions about, election denying and all that. And, and we've seen such a rise of it. So I know that Joanne has been a big proponent and has always brought us back to that whole issue of media literacy and pushing for that. That's important. I mean, it should be happening.
I think videos and social media has been very helpful on cultural issues. Maybe they'll move the needle a little bit on police reform that's so badly needed. But there are still a lot of areas that social media doesn't cover because the topics aren't as sexy. And those are the ones we're actually talking about in this report. And let me give you an example that didn't make it into our study for miscellaneous reasons. And it has to do with the Sammamish, the city of Sammamish, and when their newspaper went down. What happened was it was all done just like it is, and I don't know how big Sammamish is, but like our community, the one I live in, Kittitas County, we're very small, so we really do depend, especially now, we don't depend on our newspaper, we do depend on Facebook for different reporting from different bodies. But what happened in Sammamish was that once the newspaper went down, there were already established blogs and Facebook presences. And all the same people that were involved in city government, there was a competing narrative of what was happening in that city. And what happened was because of they went, there were certain sides that went against each other, and it ended up with the entire city council being the old one being thrown out and a new one, or there might have been a couple of old ones on there, but they were all anti-development and that came in. And there were various arguments. And what they told me, the person who came to me and was not willing to be quoted, and I had a hard time getting the rest of the story. But what happened, he felt, was that since there was no newspaper, there was no official mediator between the two sides that could say, okay, we're coming at this story from the middle ground. And so therefore the loud voices of the anti-development people won over, and those people got elected. Well, it turns out that, which happens a lot in government, is a lot of people who really are not qualified get into those positions. And so they went through a tumultuous 2 years or whatever, and they were eventually turned out. But that is what can happen when you don't have an official source where another thing is that you get the eyeballs when you're doing a controversy and not necessarily when you're just doing consistent, even coverage. And that's it is really valuable, all the new the new video and the new, I think social media is certainly not all bad. There's a lot of really good things that you can learn through it in the new way of, but they don't cover some of those non-sexy areas. And I don't know how we get around that, how you get TikTok, and it's not that they don't do serious subjects, they do. I mean, it is amazing what you can cover in a 3-minute TikTok video, but they're not doing city council. They're not doing school boards unless there's really serious controversies. So that's what's missing in that whole thing. And I think, you still need social media, and a lot of these new things that are developing are really, really valuable and really bring points home and concepts home to people. So that's just what I'm saying. That's just you're going to miss some of that. And then, and I honestly don't know, we were talking ourselves about the bright side, I don't know if they are going to survive. And, people in your county, you won't notice it. In my county, our newspaper is almost dead. It's still there. They still do like the one local story that's on the front page every day, but they're not covering government at all, unless, they do it after the fact. And so I don't know what happens after that. It's discouraging.
Well, and I
Get
think
what you deserve is what happens. I wanted to talk a little bit about the media literacy that Diane brought up, Deanne brought up. The whole idea behind media literacy is to connect the idea of journalism and information and teach young people the value of journalism and what it stands for and how it works, and deconstructing it and realizing that they aren't there to just broadcast one side or the other, that they are there to curate and figure out what side of the conflict people need to know about. It's media literacy is more than just knowing what TV station is owned by who, but it's also how does media connect to civic engagement? How does it connect to civic society and democracy? And that's something that was really thoughtful in the law that was put together in Washington State on teaching media literacy, because it's included in civic education.
Yeah, I really hear that. I think I just want to I guess encourage, as we continue to talk about this across the state, like the idea that, how do we bring the quality of news media that you're advocating for, that I agree is like so important, and, really can't be replicated fully on social media. How do we bring that and adapt it to the platforms where young people are, because they're not going away. And we need to, in addition to make people, consume media more intelligently, we also need to find those consumers where they are. And I just worry that, in the sort of conversation about print media, there may be a missed opportunity to really connect more deeply with young people on some of these platforms. And one example I'll give is Jen Wagner, who's the one of the league members in San Francisco. She did something that I thought was so innovative with their Observer Corps, which is she began attending some of the they have like a police council or public safety council down there, and she began live tweeting from their meetings, and those tweets got retweeted, right, by people who use Twitter, me and younger people, and it was, it brought those people into the league and the issues, because it was just using their language and using their platforms. And I thought, wow, that's a really cool way of taking something. It doesn't have to be, could be a tax meeting or a redistricting meeting, and making it more accessible to a wider audience.
I mean, I think the venue is not the issue for many of us. I think it's the issue of whether it's acting independently or not.
Right,
which is
totally.
one of the principles of the Society of Professional Journalists. Peggy Watt, where are you? Right, it's one of the 4 core principles.
Right.
Act independently, and that's the question that's the thing we have to really expect and demand of our media producers, right? News producers. We need to say, wait a minute, are you acting independently, or are you promoting one perspective, one point of view? And that's
Sure.
where the rubber meets the road, I think, right, Peggy?
Sure.
And as consumers, we need to demand it. That's where it comes from. When the consumers start demanding it, it's going to happen.
I think that's right. And I also think that, when we start acknowledging that, news media in many ways perpetuated some of the silencing of groups that now are getting
Mhm.
their, getting their airtime and getting their perspective shared. But like, there's still a trust building process that's happening where, I certainly think of certain news outlets as eminently independent, reasonable, neutral. But, I think about where I go through like an archives and I'm like, wow, like there were whole perspectives missing here. And so for me, it's sort of about just, I don't know, like a little acknowledgement of that as we try to reach out to some younger audiences when we talk about this issue. I think goes a really long way.
Well, there's an old idea that the media is the message. And in terms of social media, so much of it is visual. And therefore, citizen photojournalists can record what is happening in real time, slam it into a social media platform right now. The question is whether that photojournalism, which is wonderful, can be a hook to draw young viewers somehow into writing by trained journalists who also provide background and depth and broader content, so that it's not just this little tiny slice of pie, it's the whole pie, and you can tell how it was baked and at what temperature.
Right, and they provide the data sets too.
There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
As a young person, here's your assignment. Figure out how to link these two, the print and the depth, with the immediacy and the urgency of the photojournalism.
Okay, but we have to do it together. Oh, anyone else? I know I kind of chewed up a bunch of time at the end there, but I was just been so excited to ask that question and hear from you all on that piece of it.
I'd like to just comment a little bit on the accountability.
Yeah.
Transparency and accountability is one of the goals with just the Society of Professional Journalists, its code of ethics. But what students, the current generation of journalists are realizing, and frankly, I'm with them. They worry very much about being fair and being open-minded, and yet sometimes they take it to the point of, I need to be a blank slate. And they don't need to be a blank slate. They're humans. We're all humans. What we need to be is transparent about our experience that might not really, might go into a story with some background on it and some understanding of the issues. And frankly, that's what we need to do. When I was a young journalist, there was this nonsense about, oh, we can't have a woman covering the women's movement because, you wouldn't be able to do a fair job of it.
Right.
Come on, and so now, why wouldn't we let a journalist of color cover relevant issues? They're going to get stories that I can't get.
Yeah.
And so it's more the acknowledgement that we're human beings and we have backgrounds, and it's going to enhance our reporting. Not, we're not robots.
Yes, I really appreciate that.
We're not robots. So.
Yeah, neutrality is maybe not the goal. But I appreciate
fairness is the goal.
Fairness. Yeah, fairness and plus transparency, right? Yeah, I really appreciate that. Well, if nobody else has, do you have any closing words, Deanne, for your team?
Well, I think we really appreciate the interest that the Seattle King County League has in this topic. I mean, we think it's very important, and we hope you all will be reading our study, or at least the Cliff Notes version of our quick takes, and discussing it fully. And we really do hope we can come up with a consensus that this is important for the league to get involved and support. So Dolores,
Yeah.
do you have anything you want to add?
No, just to all go to your consensus meeting and reach consensus to support local journalism. That's probably what, I mean, that's really, our ask is really simple, at least from my perspective. We haven't seen a position yet, but I mean, we just really want local journalism to be supported and for that to be a league value.
Well, and because it's a public good, just like libraries, just like schools, you know, public hospitals. We think, and we think we've communicated that it's a public good.
Yeah, absolutely. A very valuable one. Well, thank you so much to your incredible team for making all of this information available for our consideration. We'll have some practice on the consensus process with the Shoreline Management Act study. So well, hopefully we will be consensus aficionados by the time we're considering your topic. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly here. Just if everybody who's here has had a wonderful time tonight. You know, we're always looking to promote the League's work and promote the incredible our own process designed to you know, instill confidence in the information that people are receiving through careful study and consensus building. So please do consider donating to support our league or the local league in your area if you're not from here. And yeah, I think that will do it for us. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll stay behind for a minute or two if folks have last minute questions.
Nice to see you, Peggy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry I had to slide in a little late, but I'm glad I was able to catch this. It was
Yeah,
great.
thank you for coming and for your technical review. All right.
Thank you. Good night.
Yes, thank you for having us. Good night.
Yeah,
Read the
toodaloo.
study.
Yeah. Check your email for links and post-event info. We'll send that out to all registered participants.